It was 1944. World War II was still raging, but deep in the mountains of New Hampshire, something even more historic than the battlefield was happening. Inside the Mount Washington Hotel, delegates from 44 nations weren't fighting a war with tanks or bullets. They were deciding which money would rule the world. For over a century, the British pound sterling had been the undisputed heavyweight of global trade. But Britain's empire was now exhausted. The war had drained its gold reserves and inflated its debt to over 200% of GDP. Desperate, Britain turned to the one country rich enough to rescue it: the United States. In that moment, the US dollar became king. Now, nearly 80 years later, history is starting to rhyme. BRICS nations, Brazil, Russia, India, China, and South Africa, are quietly laying the groundwork to dethrone the dollar, just as America once dethroned Britain. But here's the twist. Every currency collapse in history has had one common trigger: a crisis of confidence. If you want to see where this story is headed, you have to rewind to the moment the British system began to crack. For over 200 years, one currency ruled them all: the British pound sterling. It was more than just money. It was a symbol of power. From Buenos Aires to Bombay, British merchants brokered deals in pounds. British warships guarded the trade routes. British banks dominated every major port. The Bank of England sat atop vast gold reserves, anchoring the pound with real value. Raw materials flowed in from colonies across the globe: Australia, Africa, India. And British industrial might powered it all. The empire ran on sterling. It was global dominance backed by military might and economic muscle. But then came the wars. In just 30 years, 2 world wars tore through Britain's wealth. The government spent recklessly, throwing money at war machines, building tanks, churning out aircraft, shipping troops across 3 oceans. The Royal Navy, once untouchable, became overstretched and worn thin. Factories once humming with consumer goods now echoed with the sounds of wartime production. And to fund it all, Britain borrowed. From the United States, from Canada, and even from its own colonies. By 1945, the global empire that had ruled the seas was on life support. Ration books replaced prosperity. American aid kept British households from going hungry. Britain's national debt skyrocketed to an astonishing 240% of its GDP. Meanwhile, across the Atlantic, a new empire was rising. The United States held 2/3 of the world's gold reserves, roughly $20 billion in bullion. While Britain was scraping the bottom of the vault, America was swimming in wealth, fueled by wartime manufacturing. This wasn't just a money problem, it was a tectonic shift in power. America wasn't just richer, it was becoming the world's new industrial heart. Its factories outproduced every other nation combined. Its banks were flush with global deposits, and US companies were selling goods and lending money to war-torn Europe. The financial center of gravity was shifting west. Smart investors noticed. So did governments. What had once been the safest currency in the world, the pound, was beginning to look fragile. And in finance, perception becomes reality. The real collapse didn't happen in a bank. It happened in the minds of traders and policymakers around the world. Britain couldn't even feed its own citizens without help. Food was rationed until 1954, a full 9 years after the war ended. If a country can't provide bread, can you trust its banknotes? In 1947, that trust shattered. As part of its loan deal with America, Britain agreed to make the pound convertible to dollars. The result? A panic run on the pound that emptied reserves in just 5 weeks. Britain was forced to suspend convertibility and tighten foreign exchange controls, an international admission that its promises were no longer reliable. 2 years later, in 1949, came the final blow, a 30% devaluation of the pound. This wasn't a tactical tweak, it was a desperate move to make British exports cheaper and stay economically afloat. But the signal it sent was louder than any war drum. Britain was done. No reserve currency can survive that kind of collapse and still command global confidence. What followed wasn't just a currency switch, it was a transfer of empire, from colonial fleets to capitalist factories, from imperial banks to Wall Street skyscrapers. Britain had built its dominance on naval supremacy and financial control. But both were outdated weapons in the new economic order. Modern warfare and industrial rivalry had exposed the empire's limits. History doesn't repeat, but it rhymes. Britain's downfall followed a pattern we've seen before, and may see again. Military overreach, explosive debt, loss of industrial edge, global loss of confidence. These ingredients make up the recipe for currency collapse. And once all four are in the pot, the dominant empire falls, not with a bang, but with a spreadsheet. That fall created a vacuum, and into that vacuum stepped a nation with a plan. America didn't just inherit financial dominance, it built a new system designed for control. The real story isn't how Britain lost its empire, it's how America seized the throne. From the outside, Bretton Woods looked like a civilized exchange of ideas. Inside, it was a showdown between two worldviews. On one side, John Maynard Keynes, Britain's legendary economist, proposing a neutral currency called Bankrupt, an international money not controlled by any one country. On the other, Harry Dexter White, the U.S. Treasury's top strategist, with a proposal that would make the U.S. dollar the anchor of the post-war world. Keynes wanted balance, White wanted leverage. At first, it looked like a real debate. But then, America flipped the table. The U.S. didn't just come with ideas, they came with gold. By 1944, America owned around 60% of the entire world's gold supply. It was sitting in vaults from Fort Knox to Manhattan, waiting to back something bigger than bullets: influence. Britain, meanwhile, had borrowed just to show up. They were broke. Gold wasn't just symbolic, it was the foundation of every major currency. If your money couldn't be exchanged for gold, people didn't trust it. And America had more of it than anyone. White's plan was genius in its simplicity. Let every major currency peg itself to the dollar at a fixed exchange rate. The pound at $4.03. The franc at around $0.05. And so on. But here's the twist. Only the dollar would be convertible to gold. That meant if France wanted gold, they had to get dollars first. If Germany needed reserves, they had to buy dollars. If Brazil wanted to trade oil, they'd better hold dollars. The US created a two-tier system, currencies linked to the dollar, and the dollar linked to gold. Everyone else? Stuck in the middle. This made the dollar the toll booth of global trade. From 1945 to the early 1970s, the dollar wasn't just a currency. It was the air international trade breathed. Every oil deal, every wheat shipment, every cross-border transaction ran through the greenback. Need to import Japanese electronics? Pay in dollars. Want to export Venezuelan oil? Invoice in dollars. Every trade increased global demand for the dollar, and the US printed it on demand. It was a silent coup. No tanks, no battles. Just paper, printing presses, and policy. And it worked like magic. In 1948, global trade hovered at $124 billion. By 1973, it surpassed $1 trillion, and nearly every cent touched the dollar. American banks processed payments. American clearinghouses handled settlements. The dollar became as necessary to the world economy as electricity. And the more people traded, the more dollars they needed. It was a perpetual motion machine of influence. But inside that brilliance hid a fatal flaw. Bretton Woods was built on one dangerous assumption: that America would always have enough gold to back its dollars. But as global trade grew, so did the demand for dollars. And so, the US printed more. By the late 1960s, countries started asking questions. Was there enough gold left? France, led by Charles de Gaulle, called the US system an exorbitant privilege. He demanded gold in exchange for his country's dollar reserves and sent warships to pick it up. Other countries followed. The gold started to bleed from Fort Knox. The alarm bells rang. In 1971, President Richard Nixon did something no one expected. He shut the gold window. America would no longer convert dollars to gold. He called it temporary, but the world called it something else. The death of Bretton Woods. But here's the shocking twist. The dollar didn't die. It survived. Not because it was still backed by gold, but because by 1971, it was too big to fail. The dollar had become embedded in the plumbing of global trade. There was no alternative ready to replace it. Here's the secret most people miss. Currency dominance isn't just about economics, it's about infrastructure and momentum. Once the dollar became the lubricant of global commerce, it didn't matter if it was backed by gold or thin air. Changing it would have been like switching out the world's electric grid overnight. The US understood this and engineered it that way. Keynes warned the world. The world didn't listen. What if Keynes had won? What if the Bankrupt had been adopted? What if no single country had gained currency control? History would look very different. But in 1944, America had the leverage, and they used it masterfully. This wasn't luck, it was strategy. And it's the reason why the dollar still rules today, even without gold. But just like the pound fell, and just like every empire before it, every system has its breaking point. And now others are quietly building their own plans to one day do what America did in 1944. History is filled with moments where everything almost changed. Moments where one decision, one act of courage, one united front could have reshaped the financial future of the world. And in the story of dollar dominance, there weren't just whispers of change. There were 3 earthquakes that never hit. These weren't vague possibilities. They were real, measurable turning points. And if history had bent just slightly differently, the US dollar might never have become king. So, let's go back and examine these 3 moments. Moments that nearly rewrote the world order. The first pivot point came at Bretton Woods itself. 2 men walked into that conference with very different dreams for the global economy. You already know Harry Dexter White, the American pushing for dollar dominance. But standing across from him was John Maynard Keynes, the British economist who foresaw the risks of giving one country total monetary control. Keynes wasn't just theorizing, he proposed a complete alternative system, a global clearing union with a neutral currency called Bankrupt at the center. No single nation would control it. No country could abuse it. It would reward balanced trade and punish hoarding or excessive borrowing. To many in Europe, still scarred from war and wary of American influence, the idea made perfect sense. But here's what killed it: desperation. Britain was broke. They needed American loans to stay afloat, and America controlled 60% of the world's gold. So, reluctantly, the world nodded to White's plan. But imagine if it hadn't. Imagine a world where Bankrupt became the backbone of trade, and no single government could weaponize its currency. That was the first fork in the road, and the world blinked. Fast forward to 1956. Britain and France, still trying to hold on to imperial relevance, invade Egypt to reclaim control of the Suez Canal after it was nationalized by President Nasser. But there was a third player, a rising superpower watching from across the Atlantic, the United States, and America was furious. So what did they do? They didn't send troops. They used the new weapon of modern empires: finance. President Eisenhower threatened to dump British sterling bonds on the open market, causing a currency collapse. He also blocked access to IMF emergency funds, pressuring Britain and France to withdraw, humiliated. But here's the what if. What if, in the wake of that defeat, Europe said enough? What if Britain, France, Germany, and Italy, who were simultaneously forming the European Economic Community, had turned their shared shame into shared ambition? France had gold. Germany was rebuilding fast. The European economies were aligning. The moment was perfect to create a continental payment system, perhaps even a European reserve currency, decades ahead of the euro. Instead, they licked their wounds. They rebuilt slowly, and the dollar's grip tightened further. It was a second missed moment, and this time political unity failed. August 15, 1971. President Nixon walks to a podium and delivers one of the most impactful economic announcements in history. The U.S. would no longer honor the promise to convert dollars to gold. The key moment came months later, in 1973, when Saudi Arabia agreed to price oil exclusively in dollars in exchange for U.S. military protection. And just like that, a new system was born, the petrodollar. Now every country needed dollars not just for trade, but to buy energy. But imagine the alternative. What if Europe, Japan, and OPEC said no? What if they demanded gold-based payments, or introduced a basket currency like Bankrupt? What if they created a parallel trade network that didn't rely on America? It was possible, but it never happened, because they weren't ready. And more importantly, they couldn't agree. At Bretton Woods, desperation killed Bankrupt. In Suez, humiliation didn't birth unity. And in 1971, opportunity knocked, but no one opened the door. Currency transitions happen when the dominant power is weak, alternatives are credible, and coordination is fast and focused. The US faced none of those combined threats, and so the dollar's reign continued. This isn't just an economic trivia quiz. This is the blueprint, because today's challenges to the dollar, from BRICS to blockchain, will face the same three tests. Is America weak enough? Are the challengers united enough? And is there an option that's clearly better? If the answer isn't yes to all three, history will repeat itself. So the next time you hear about the death of the dollar, ask yourself, is this moment different? Or is it just another missed opportunity playing out again? It didn't make headlines like Bretton Woods. There was no dramatic photo of leaders signing a new global currency pact. But in 2024, something quietly historic happened in Kazan, Russia. BRICS leaders, Brazil, Russia, India, China, and South Africa, didn't declare war on the dollar. Instead, they unveiled blueprints for something more disruptive, a silent financial revolution. Forget the idea of a single BRICS currency overnight. That's a distraction. What they're building is far more subtle and far more dangerous to the current system. Think of the global dollar system as a superhighway. BRICS isn't trying to destroy that highway. They're constructing alternate toll roads beside it. Payment systems, currency swaps, commodity exchanges, each is a side route that could one day make the dollar optional. And the scale of this ambition? Colossal. BRICS collectively controls $28 trillion in GDP, more than America's $25 trillion. They hold the keys to 40% of global oil and a quarter of the world's wheat exports. Every country needs what BRICS is selling. That gives them power. The kind of power that can dictate how payments are made, and in what currency. China has already laid tracks for this alternative system. Its cross-border interbank payment system now processes over $12 trillion annually. That's not a theory. It's real infrastructure that links over 1,300 institutions across 100 countries. Banks from Asia to Africa are now bypassing SWIFT and the dollar. And the more they do, the more America's financial grip loosens. And it's not just China. Russia and China's trade, once dollar-based, is now settled in rubles and yuan. Tenfold growth since 2022. $200 billion annually, flowing without a single dollar involved. That's not speculation, that's reality. India's doing the same, securing rupee-settled trade agreements with over 20 countries. Brazil's pushing Latin America to use local currencies in regional trade. From soybeans to oil, transactions once priced in dollars are being rewritten in rupees, pesos, and reals. Slowly but surely, these nations are draining dollar demand from the global system, one bilateral deal at a time. And now they're building a commodity exchange platform. Imagine this: oil, gold, and grain, all traded without a dollar in sight. No conversion fees, no US oversight, no petrodollar monopoly. If they succeed, billions in daily dollar transactions could vanish. But here's where most analysts get it wrong. This isn't an attack. There's no united front against the dollar. What we're witnessing is 5 different agendas converging, each nation chasing its own interest, not waving a common anti-dollar banner. China wants the yuan to matter globally. Russia needs financial lifeboats post-sanctions. India is chasing lower conversion costs. Brazil wants to stop pricing its resources in someone else's currency. No ideology, just practical incentives. Every time in history that a global reserve currency has changed hands, it wasn't by accident. It followed a cold, calculable formula. The challenger had to beat the reigning currency champion in not 1, not 2, but 3 ruthless economic metrics: trade volume, market depth, and monetary stability. And here's the twist. BRICS might be trying to play this same game. But are they even close? Let's break it down. Trade volume is the scoreboard. It reveals which currency the world is actually using to do business. In 2023, BRICS nations recorded $1.1 trillion in intra-block trade. That's massive. But trade is only one part of the formula. Next comes market depth, the ability to move vast amounts of money without causing shockwaves. America? It's the kingpin, with $50 trillion in liquid financial markets. A currency needs liquidity to earn trust. And finally, monetary stability, the Achilles heel of most currency challengers. The US dollar barely flinches, swinging just 1 to 2% monthly. But BRICS? The ruble, for instance, crashed 50% in 2022. Now, if you look at history, something becomes shockingly clear. Currency transitions don't happen when one metric gets passed. They happen when all 3 metrics are crushed simultaneously, without doubt. That's how Britain fell and America rose. There was no gray area, just dominance. But with BRICS, things get murky. Their headline stats are impressive. 32% of global GDP, 42% of the world's population. And it sounds like a warning shot to dollar dominance. But headlines hide the cracks. Size alone doesn't win this war. Having a giant economy is like having a massive army with no ammunition if the financial weapons aren't functional. Let's look deeper, starting with China, the engine of BRICS. Its $17 trillion economy is second only to the US. But the problem? Capital markets remain closed. The yuan can't flow freely. While America invites global capital into its $50 trillion playground, China keeps its gates half shut. That's a deal breaker for any currency hoping to become the world's reserve. Then comes the elephant in the room: infrastructure. America's financial plumbing runs $5 trillion through its pipes every single day. SWIFT, Fedwire, chips. These aren't just networks, they're the arteries of global commerce. BRICS' systems, they're functional, but tiny by comparison. Dollar-based systems are so smooth you barely notice them, and that's the point. There's another hidden fortress protecting the dollar: foreign currency reserves. According to the IMF, 58% of global reserves are still held in US dollars. That's not just preference, that's necessity. Most central banks can't afford to see the dollar collapse because their own wealth is tied to it. And if that wasn't enough, the dollar enjoys one of the most powerful weapons in economics: network effects. Every additional institution that joins the dollar system increases its dominance. Switching becomes painful, risky, expensive. BRICS would need to convince thousands of institutions to abandon a system that's been working for decades. That's not strategy, that's a moonshot. So yes, BRICS does have the economic muscle to mount a challenge. Their GDP matches America's. Their trade volumes suggest real demand for alternatives. But the missing pieces? They're critical. Unstable currencies, shallow markets, and weak infrastructure, they don't just slow down a challenge, they stop it dead. And history shows us one harsh truth. Every failed reserve currency challenger believed that size alone was enough. It never is. So, after all the bold declarations, impressive GDP stats, and futuristic infrastructure plans, what's the real verdict? BRICS now faces the same fundamental wall that has blocked every empire before them from unseating the dominant reserve currency. It's not just about power or ambition. To overthrow a currency like the dollar, you need to clear 3 brutal checkpoints: economic necessity, political unity, and a better alternative. All 3 at the same time. And right now, they're getting closer, but they're not there yet. Yes, BRICS is building real financial highways, alternative payment networks, bilateral trade routes, and new commodity platforms. But despite the noise, the dollar remains deeply wired into the system, in global trade, finance, even debt contracts. It's not about who wants change, it's about who's willing and able to rewire an entire financial world. But here's the twist. This story isn't about BRICS versus the dollar. It's about you, the person watching. Because throughout history, reserve currency transitions didn't just shift wealth between nations. They redefined who got rich and who got left behind. So the question isn't if the dollar will lose its crown. It's whether you'll recognize the signs when it happens. Patterns don't lie, they repeat. Empires collapse the same way. New ones rise with the same clues. And if you know what to look for, you'll be ready. Ready to bet on the next dollar. Ready to move when the tide turns. Because the next global currency isn't coming with a press release. It's coming in disguised as history repeating itself. If you found this video insightful, like, subscribe, and hit the notification bell to get notified whenever we upload another video. Your support helps the channel grow. Thanks for watching.